I'm going to talk about, and from the conversation I was having at the tables, I think that I probably have as much to learn as I have to share, but about what is a newer phenomena, or maybe more recently discovered in the United States, which is the issue of simultaneous bilingual learners and their language and literacy needs. So what I'm going to try to do with one hand here is, first of all, just review with you what is an exciting and emerging body of research in the United States about bilingualism and biliteracy, which I call the gift that keeps on giving. I mean, there's almost no day that you don't pick up a newspaper and read something about the cognitive benefits of bilingualism and how it helps us. So there's really no downside to being a bilingual person unless, of course, you're the child of recent immigrants in the United States and you speak Spanish, in which case your sole job is to learn English and assimilate. There, I said it. Okay, I feel better. But we do have a body of research that tells us that being bilingual and biliterate is actually a good thing. We need to talk about the new normal. And the new normal in our country, our children are not immigrant children. We have a lot of immigrant children. But by and large, the largest population of children we're serving in U.S. schools are children of immigrants. They were born in the United States. And I have to intersperse what I'm saying here with political, so a few political observations. When you're born in the United States, you're a U.S. citizen. And you enjoy all the rights thereof. So it's a little bit troubling to pick up newspapers. I'm sure this doesn't happen in Illinois, but in my state, it's a little bit troubling to pick up a newspaper and read something about, do we really have to educate these immigrants? Why don't they learn English? It's a little bit troubling when we know now that 67% of all of the kids who come to our schools with the label of English learner are children who were born here, and that number is 75% for elementary kids. So we're talking about children who, by and large, are U.S. citizens. Okay, so that's the new normal, and we're going to talk about that. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about how we misjudge what are likely normal behaviors of simultaneous bilingual kids because we don't understand the phenomena very well. We still insist on trying to search for a dominant language somewhere, and when it doesn't present itself, then we think that there's something wrong, there's a problem that's situated somehow in a child. And how do we change practice? So not just, we misjudge these behaviors in ways that often define kids in deficit ways. And then how do we change practice to maximize the children's opportunities to become bilingual? So those are the key points, and she said, briefly, touch on each one briefly, so I promise to do that. So, bilingualism is an advantage. We know it's a cognitive advantage for children. We've got research that's emerging about babies, and believe me, middle-class parents and upper-middle-class parents are running out and finding the quickest way to enroll their kids in two-language schools. I have a niece and a nephew in El Paso. They both grew up only speaking Spanish. They're both college-educated, and they had a baby. And you know what middle-class people do when they have a baby? They read books. They got plenty of people. You got nanas galore, but nobody believes them. So they read books. And so they, come home with the baby. And Isaiah, my nephew, when he was born a few years ago, they said to my husband and I, you know how you don't want to talk shop when you're visiting family? Because you know you're going to get into it. So I said, should we teach Isaiah Spanish? Like, are you crazy? Why wouldn't you? They live in El Paso, Texas. I mean, anyway. They insisted on black and white mobiles in the crib because somehow that stimulates cognitive. They got in music for the crib. They're worried that becoming bilingual might confuse him. But two of you are confused. So we know. But never mind, even children of, if you grew up speaking Spanish in this country, you still wonder if it was a good idea, even if you're proud that you're bilingual. We have lots of research about the cognitive benefits. We know it's a linguistic benefit. We know it's an academic benefit if in the right circumstances. We know that bilingualism is good for a community. We need bilingual teachers, doctors, and lawyers, and you all know that, especially living in Chicago. It's good for a nation. Let's not forget what the Navajo code talkers did for us in World War II. We know it is good for our country. And unfortunately, at some of the biggest crises time in our history, we haven't had the bilingual speakers that we need. Stephen Krashen, a long, long time ago, 30 years ago, said, we need spies and salesmen. let's face it, if we're going to continue to be number one in the world, and the only way we're going to be good spies and salesmen if we can do that in more than one language, especially in the 21st century. I like to think that being bilingual could be a tool for world peace more than a tool for spying. But so the key is that this bilingualism in any form sharpens the mind. It's a cognitive advantage. However, it cannot be occasional use. So we have to encourage people to go out and keep on using what they know. Okay, now, we know that it's a cognitive advantage early in life. This research comes out of Spain, and it's absolutely fascinating, where they follow babies that have mothers who only speak to them in Catalan, and they follow babies whose mothers only speak to them in Spanish, and then they follow babies who are getting input in both Catalan and Spanish. And they find that as early as 9 months old, these babies can do things cognitively that the babies being raised in monolingual homes can't do, like following jaw movements. So they're paying attention to meaning and to getting language in ways that monolingually raised babies aren't. This is why middle-class people are flocking. Bilingualism in early childhood is not a problem, but we force immigrant parents to choose English as quickly as possible, meaning that we might deny them of the cognitive advantages of becoming bilingual. Bilingualism in school and beyond. You've probably read Ellen Bialystok, who's, I'm a fan of her. She's one of my sheroes. She does a lot of research about bilinguals and how they're better at multitasking. And one of her favorite studies is when you put simulators, when you have people in driving, where they're simulating driving, and you give them extraneous noise. The bilinguals are better at filtering out the extraneous noise and paying attention to what's important. So they're less distracted at driving. Now, isn't that amazing? Yeah, now, the research says you shouldn't drive while distracted. That's what it says. Driving while distracted is not recommended. But neuroimaging has demonstrated that the whole brain appears to rewire when you know more than one language. And it enhances the executive function of our brain. It's a good idea. At my age, this is my personal favorite. As we age, we know that normally aging bilinguals have better cognitive functioning than monolingual human beings. In fact, the regular use of two languages we have known appears to delay the onset of Alzheimer's by as much as 5 or 6 years. But high school French doesn't count. And I've studied, does it count that I got a B? So the bilingualism in any form sharpens the mind. It's a cognitive advantage. The research is out there. It is compelling. It's conclusive. It's almost hard to find a study that says if you have a choice, make your kid monolingual. It's really, we'd be hard-pressed to find that research. We just don't seem to practice it too much. Joshua Fishman talks about the American double standard for bilingualism, and he said he recently passed away, but he is also one of my all-time heroes. Many Americans have long been of the opinion that bilingualism is a good thing if it's acquired via travel, preferably to Europe, or via formal education, preferably at Harvard. But it's a bad thing if it was acquired from one's immigrant parents or grandparents. And I think that that's as true now as it was in 1972 when Fishman first wrote it. And I think that's what we're dealing with in our school, our policy issues that are getting in our way of understanding our children better. Okay, so bilingualism is what we call the gift that keeps on giving. And this is from a brand new book by Patricia Gandara and Rebecca Callahan called The Bilingual Advantage. And these are just excerpts from that research. I said it's the gift that keeps on giving. They didn't say that. So we know that bilingually educated students have greater cognitive flexibility, working memory, and executive functioning. We know that. We know that bilingually raised students have more cohesive family relations and fewer behavior problems. Now, knowing that this doesn't happen in Chicago, I'll tell you what's very common in our state is by the time many kids who come to school speaking Spanish as a first language get into middle school, the code of communication between parents and children has changed. The parents continue speaking to the children in Spanish, but the children begin to answer their parents in English. And that creates communication problems. This research is quite clear that parents who demand that their children continue to speak Spanish and answer them in Spanish have fewer behavior problems and get along better with their parents. Now, it's at that very time. Immigrant parents are often afraid that they're going to do something wrong. They love their children. They want their children to speak English. And when their children start speaking English, they are so happy about it because they know how difficult life is for them because they can't speak English. So when the kids come home and start using English to answer them, they frequently let it happen. And it's at that point that we have to tell them, you guys got to get stubborn. You've got to continue to encourage your kids. We can teach English at school. You can help us by making sure that your code of communication in your home continues to be the one that you are most comfortable with. We frequently don't do that. And I'll say I've raised 2 kids myself, and they turned out okay, thank goodness. Well, kind of. No, they're okay. But I'll say when they were in middle school was the time that neither one of them wanted to speak Spanish anymore. So much so that my husband likes to march our car in the driveway. He does it every Saturday. He just loves to. And he plays Mexican music. And when my son was in middle school, he went out and says, Dad, could we turn down the music? Somebody might think we're Mexicans. And my husband said, we are. But I just want, the message is so strong to not be Spanish speaking, to not be Mexican. That message is not given to English speaking kids in dual language programs. They do not have to face those kinds of issues as they are acquiring biliteracy. Okay, we know that students who maintain their bilingualism into high school are more likely to go to 4-year colleges. That's why we're busy trying to pass seals of biliteracy in a lot of our states to give kids credit. In our state, when we get the seal of biliteracy, the first thing I'm going to do is go to our registrar's office and say, let's put a weight on kids who have the seal of biliteracy for admissions criteria. Let's really make it an advantage to be bilingual. Students who maintain bilingualism into high school are less likely to drop out. And young students who maintain bilingualism will earn more in the labor force than their monolingual peers. All of this is in that book, in Callahan and Gandara's book. You can hardly wait to see it. Now, so we know there are benefits. These are kind of old data, but we haven't seen any indication that the numbers are changing. So the red line, the red part of the graph you see there is the growth in the number of kids that we would consider to be English language learners from 1989 to 2005. And the blue line is the growth in all K-12 students for the same period of time. I'm going to ask you a question from the park. Which one is larger? Good, and I'll answer that, right? I have to put it on Facebook as questions my child brought home I can't answer. So what we know are the fastest growing school-age population of kids are these kids that we label as English language learners. That in work that I do, we've tried to change that term to emerging bilinguals, but they're more commonly called English language learners. They've grown 100%, 160% nationally from 1990 to 2005, while the overall population of K-12 students has only grown by 20%. We simply have to invest in this population of kids, invest in a good education for them. Our future depends on it. You're all young sitting in the audience, but those of us who are just a few years away from the home really need a well-educated workforce to support us. Okay, we know that emerging bilingual kids are concentrated in the following ways. 75% of them are in grades K-4. Within school districts, individual schools are highly segregated. So while people might say our district is highly diverse linguistically, in fact, you see pockets of schools where 100% of the kids are Spanish speaking, and you see schools where there's not one kid who speaks a language other than English. They're also heavily concentrated linguistically. 85% speak Spanish. That's a national trend, and that's growing. It's very different from the last wave of immigration in the beginning of the 20th century, where you had people coming from all kinds of different countries. Here we have a big second language group, and that's Spanish speaking. And we're not all that diverse linguistically, period. 95% of all of our linguistic diversity is accounted for in 5 languages, which could be changing. So Spanish, Vietnamese, Chinese, Korean, and Hmong. Those are the 5 most commonly other language spoken. Now, Denver, we have 130 language groups represented in the school district. But 40% of the the 40% of the entire school district are labeled English learners. 85% of the kids speak Spanish. Then we have, one Punjabi family. We got a few Russian speakers. We've got some Somalis, but collectively they don't make up the numeric total that Spanish kids do. 67% of all of our emerging bilingual kids are U.S. born. They're U.S. citizens. I want to keep saying that over and over and over again. So they represent a new normal. So the new normal is U.S. born bilinguals and kids who are simultaneous bilinguals. And simultaneous bilinguals have a couple of different definitions in the literature, but they're generally kids who have been exposed to 2 or more languages since birth and before the age of 5. And in some cases, they're defined as before the age of 3. In our research, we're defining before the age of 5. Most of the programs that we have in the United States right now are based on sequential notions of bilingualism, that you have to learn one language first, then you can add a second one. And that's hence our national rush to identify a dominant language, because if we don't have a dominant language, we can't implement our sequential program that's prefaced on we have to start teaching in your dominant language. Most of the kids will come to school speaking some of 2 languages. We have very sophisticated ways of deficit labels of these kids. Sometimes they're called semilingual, sometimes they're called non-non. And then we have a very common thread that runs through a lot of our schools that if they have no language anyway, let's just teach them in English. And so this is a very common way of describing this population that I think is really wrong. This is a cartoon. I don't know if you get Baldo in your newspaper, but this is Baldo. Baldo's one of our simultaneous bilingual kids in Denver, and his dad sends him to the ATM machine. And of course, in the ATM machine, you can press E, 1 for English or 2 for Spanish. And his dad says, "Baldo, where's my money?" And he said, "The machine broke down." How did the machine break down? Well, it said press 1 for English or 2 for Spanish, and I pressed both buttons. So these are the kids are. They're pressing both buttons. And we have to understand them a little bit better. Okay, so normal behaviors. So most of our kids are simultaneous bilinguals. Most of our programs are sequential bilingual programs. And now we're wondering what to do with these kids who come to school seemingly not having a dominant language. I would like to propose to you that we need a new theory, and I think that there are a lot of us who are working on the new theory of a new normal, that we have normal behavior on the part of these kids, but we have bad judgments in the way that we assess them and diagnose what we think their problems are. And they include 4 things: cross-language processing, interlanguage or interference, language shifts, and code switching. So in Denver, a kid could be born in a hospital, literally, to Spanish-speaking parents, and the nurse says, "Congratulations, you have a beautiful baby girl." And the mother says, "Ay, que chula." That child begins to hear 2 languages from the time they were born, and likely before they were born. The child may live in this nice neighborhood and hear only Spanish for 2 or 3 years, and then go to Head Start, where English is the medium of instruction. And then after they go to Head Start, they go to school, and we go, what do we do? They don't seem to know any language very well. Now, this is a problem of context. This is an issue of context, because we all learn language depending on the context where we live and the opportunities that we have to learn each of those languages. Okay, so I want to say, here's what I want to tell you. Our research community has been no faster to get onto the new normal than our community of teachers practicing in the public schools. And I brought this example to show you just that. I was at a conference a couple of years ago in Houston, and the presenter, who was a statistician from Temple University, a very well-respected university in Philadelphia, says, "I've come to the conclusion, after looking at the bilingual writing of 2,000 kids, that this is a unique form of bilingual dyslexia. I wanted to jump out of my chair and scream, because I could imagine the language policies that were being created around an imagined dyslexia." And his dyslexia was the kid wrote this and I can't read it, therefore the problem is the kids. So I would like to read you, and I'll bet you every bilingual teacher in this room can read this child's writing sample, right? My favorite toy. My favorite toy is a bunny, and he danced. My mom gave it in Christmas. I love when he dances. I love him so much. He moves his ears when he dances. My bunny is white. It's not even dry here. Okay, so my colleagues and I were sitting there saying, Now, what you do notice about this child, thank you so much. What you do notice about this child is a cross-language processing. This child is using two languages to process information and communicate in writing. So you see things like bunny, B-O-N-I. Absolutely good approximation of how you spell bunny. And as a matter of fact, a lot of native English-speaking kids spell bunny like this. So if we want to say this is language interference, we can't do that because, in fact, second language kids do a lot in writing that native English-speaking kids do. P, J-I. Where does that come from? I know how to spell it in Spanish. J sounds like I want to write P. So the problem is in who's reading it, not what the child is writing. And in our state, we brought up a situation years and years ago that was never rectified, that most of the people who were reading the writing samples of kids on our high-stakes tests were monolingual English-speaking people making judgments about the 40,000 kids in Denver who speak English as a second language. So that's cross-language processing. So frequently we look at cross-language processing as a sign of some sort of a deficit that's situated in the child, instead of the fact that we have too many monolinguals making judgments. Okay, the second thing is we confuse interference, and it has to do with processing. Language interference, how many of you have heard the word interference? Oh, his Spanish is interfering with his English. Oh, his English is interfering with his Spanish. We've heard that. Interference occurs in second language acquisition when vocabulary or syntax patterns from a learner's first language cause errors in second language performance. Notice the second sentence. The term is used largely in the United States and increasingly in the rest of the world because of its negative and derogatory connotations. And that's from the Encyclopedia of Bilingualism from 2002. Now, how many of you have heard interlanguage? We don't sit, because you took a class in second language acquisition theories, yes. What's that? You did. Okay. So interlanguage is an intermediate form of language used by second language learners in the process of learning language. It includes some transfers or borrowing from the first language and is an approximate system with regard to grammar and communicating meaning, also from the Encyclopedia of Bilingualism. If your frame of reference is interference, then you see a first language as a barrier to the acquisition of the second language. If interlanguage is your frame of reference, then you see the first language as a scaffold, as a way of helping to acquire a second language. I would say for a lot of kids, we use interlanguage frameworks with English-speaking kids, and we use interference frameworks with second language kids in school. Okay, so some examples. We were just talking about this as our table. We had better examples here. Here are examples from kid language. Este es red, ¿verdad, teacher? How many of you have kids who say things like that? These are the kids who spoke Spanish until they went to Head Start and learned all the colors in English. Language is learned in context. Kimberly está esquipeando. Or are they mi Game Boy and mi Cubby? Let's go. Vamos. Okay, so let's take a look at those. On one side, if you have an interference framework, in Colorado they call it Tex-Mex. Anything we don't like, we put on the Tex-Mex. This is Tex-Mex. These are people who say, well, this child has no clear language dominance. They're semilingual. They speak Spanglish. They have cross-language confusion. Now, that's a frame of reference that very much dominates the way we look at a lot of iterated kids into our kindergarten. If we have an interlanguage framework, all language is learned in context. So when your context for learning colors and numbers is all in English, and your context for learning that big person who's standing in front of the room telling me to sit down and be quiet is called the teacher, then when somebody asks you what color is this, you say it in the context in which you've had an opportunity to learn it. And many parents send their kids to school to learn things like the colors and the numbers, and they teach them to be bien educados at home. We know for native English speaking kids that overgeneralization of language rules is very, very common. When native English speaking kids who are 4 years old say things like, we go to the store and we buy groceries, nobody gets worried. Why? We know they're going to figure it out. And we know that they've done something that's absolutely normal. They know how to put something in the past tense. We go to the store. We know they're going to figure it out. When a kid comes to school and says, Kimberly está esquipeando, what's that kid done? Borrowed a verb from English, skip, conjugated in an absolutely grammatically correct way. And we're worried about interference. That's a pretty good example of interlanguage. Guardé mi Game Boy and mi cubby. You know what Game Boys are called in Mexico? Game Boys. And cubbies are non-existent. Cubbies, nobody has a cubby, everybody has a mochila. Okay, so the point of all this is that when kids come to school doing what are probably very normal behaviors, we don't yet have a theory and we don't yet have a practice that understands those behaviors and acknowledges them for what they are, quite normal. So what happens is Jose knows 3 colors in Spanish and 3 in English, the same 3, and he's labeled limited in both his first and his second language. And somebody says, well, they're the same 3 colors. He still knows 2 codes to express 1 concept. That's a cognitive advantage. That's not the way we look at Jose. Bill knows 5, all in English. He gets labeled as average. Who knows more? Well, I would say that 3 plus 3 is 6. And even on the park, 6 is better than 5. Or more than 5, right? That's what I think. Who knows? Okay, so we need more positive interpretations. We need a better understanding of what it means when kids come to school. And we think nothing of English-speaking kids coming into dual language programs knowing 0 Spanish. We're absolutely willing to acknowledge that with those kids, we need to start at the very beginning. But if simultaneous bilingual kids come into school, we frequently say Spanish is a barrier in the acquisition of language, and maybe we shouldn't teach them bilingually. The only kids we should teach bilingually are the kids that have a clear dominance in Spanish. And I think that's a mistake, and I think it's a rather common mistake that we make. Okay, so here, interference or interlanguage. This comes from a 2nd grade writing sample. This is one of those kids, those bilingual dyslexic kids. My story is of 3 pigs and 1 lobo feroz. The lobo throw down the house of paja. Then the little pig go running to the house of his brother and say, what happened to the house? The voice is great. The problem is if you're not bilingual, you can't read it. You can't understand what this kid is writing. And so the work that I've been involved in, if anybody wants to help us, we have 8,000 writing samples. There are actually 4,000, but the kids are writing in 2 languages coming in the next couple of weeks, and we're going to spend the summer analyzing them. So if anyone would like to help us, I'm here recruiting. I'm sorry, they like you to ask me. So the analytic strategies that we use are, we say, what are the strategies, not what is the kid's deficit, what are the strategies? So the kid's using Spanish phonetic principles to express himself in English. Do we want to see that in 4th and 5th grade? No, but it's okay for the 2nd grade. It's a normal stage of development. So pigs for pigs, his for his, what for what. The kid is using Spanish syntax. He knows words are ordered. He's using the order of Spanish. So we get the house of paja instead of the straw house. And he has some lexical code switches. Lobo for wolf, paja for straw, and feroz for ferocious. It is not a bad thing that a 2nd grade kid owns a word like ferocious. That's not a bad thing. So we're talking about strategies. Now, again, do we want to see this these same behaviors going on in 4th and 5th grade? No. But it's a whole different way of saying what strategies are the kids employing, rather than to say this is a mess and how are we going to fix it. It's a totally different orientation. Okay, so language shift happens. And it's a change from the use of one language to another within an individual or a language community. 80% of emerging bilinguals coming to schools in the U.S. we know will have lost their productive ability in their first language by the time they're in high school. That's Jim Cummins' work, and that, to me, that's stark, and that's pretty. So you might say, what's the big deal? The big deal is the late onset of Alzheimer's happens when people are actively using their two languages. So we're taking away from kids the things that they need to keep their cognitive edge and advantage. One of my, a good friend and colleague, Marta Silva, did this study here in Chicago about 30, how long ago was it? 1989? Come on, quick. 28 years ago, 27 years ago. So what she did was she looked at Puerto Rican kids and she followed them from ages 4 to 7. And the same kids here in Chicago. And gender agreement, as you all know if you speak Spanish, is important in Spanish, but not so important in English. And so she looked at 237 kids, and she gave them an oral language test at each one of those years. And at age 4, what she found is the majority of kids in her sample had the ability to do gender agreement. They knew it was el muchacho, they knew it was la rana, and they knew most of the exceptions, like el agua, or el problema, or la mano. At age 7, the children, the same kids, were losing their ability to do gender agreement in Spanish. Now, they were saying things like el maestra, which is the stuff that English-speaking kids do in dual language programs when they're learning because we don't have gender agreement in English. The point is this, at age 4, all of these kids were normally developing in their Spanish language acquisition, but by age 7, the same children could have been labeled as language delayed. And back then, we weren't so involved or worried about preschool kids, but boy, by the time you get to 2nd grade, if you haven't mastered just about everything there is to master, we begin to get worried. And if we think you're not doing well in English, then we give you a Spanish test, and we can give you a Spanish test to confirm what our worries were, which really isn't anything except that you haven't had an opportunity to continue to develop in your home language. Okay, so here's the point, and my time's almost up. Bilingual kids are frequently judged as being limited in both of their languages, and formal assessments that don't consider how two languages interact just confirm our ideas about the limits in two languages. And without support in the first language, language shift happens as early as age 4, and by high school, for all intents and purposes, we have a whole bunch of kids who can understand Spanish but can no longer speak Spanish. Okay, so how do we prevent language loss? I mentioned to you already, we need to encourage parents to continue to parent in their native language. We have research that says that helps their kids behave, and who doesn't want well-behaved kids in school? Tell me. I'm challenging you. Parents need to be encouraged to speak to their children and demand that the kids respond in their first language. We need to have books and libraries and video and all kinds of things in our school, even if it isn't a bilingual school. We need to encourage kids to maintain their first language. We need to encourage teachers to allow kids to use Spanish as a processing language if they need to while they're learning English. And if parents say, we want our kids to help us learn English, and they frequently do, pick a time at home and do it for an hour, but don't change the code of communication in a home. And we know that dual language is the best option, not the most frequent one. Okay, code switching. How many of you have heard bad things about those little dreaded code switchers in our school? That we were just talking about, there's all up and down Federal Boulevard in Denver, there are all kinds of bilingual restaurants, and everybody's got signs bilingually, like T-shirt tienda with parking atrás. What we know about code switching is it matters more about who's doing it than what the code switches actually are. Because in fact, when English speakers code switch, it tends to be positive if you're a majority language speaker. So if you say something like, it's so bourgeois to go to McDonald's in Italy, bourgeois is not an English word. That's a code switch. Yo quiero Taco Bell. Who got that little dog to make that commercial that everybody, and nobody said, couldn't they do the whole commercial in English? What's the matter with McDonald's? Steven Seagal is so macho. Okay, so all of those are code switches, but no one will be negatively judged for code switching. However, if kids come to school and say, me cantaron happy birthday to you, oh my God, they're getting confused in two languages. My best day was when I have a respuesta perfect. I love that kid. A mí me gustó cuando fuimos on field trip. So we know that code switching has more to do with who's doing the code switching than what it actually entails. And that any kid who grows up speaking two languages code switches at some point, including us as teachers, if we admit it. Mañana vamos a tener los tests. Ay, Chihuahua. And we say that in the teacher's lounge all the time. And what Charmaine Kenner says is the wider society does its best to keep children's languages separate, but kids tend to synthesize and use all their resources in situations. Further, the availability of alternatives is a key aspect of growing up bilingual. One of the studies that we did for reading recovery, I remember this kid who says, we were giving the alphabet test in Spanish. The kid says, "Esta es la P." And no, he said, "Esta es la P." And we said, "Okay, you know that in Spanish? Sí, es la P." Well, why didn't you tell us that? Suena mejor en inglés. Kid, don't you realize you're never going to second grade if you keep doing that? Okay, so other examples of simultaneous worlds. The principle of it is te dice, "Hola, ¿cómo estás?" or "Hi, how are you?" So we see kids doing this, but because they're learning language in context. The biggest problems, and I have that in quotation marks, with regard to code switching among emerging bilingual kids may have more to do with our attitudes, the way we interpret their code switches, and our desire to fix the problem than what the kids are actually doing. They're actually more likely not being confused. So a new view. Simultaneous bilinguals use Spanish and other languages to get to English in cognitively appropriate but misunderstood ways. And the research community is as guilty of misinterpreting the behaviors as are the practitioners. And it's largely, I think, because we live in a country that's monolingual, and 80% of what we know about how kids learn to read and child oral language comes from monolingual researchers doing research on monolingual kids and being applied to bilingual kids without question. And if we're going to be successful, we've got to understand the new normal and build on children's strengths. So with that, I will say thank you very much. And do we have time for questions? Or I'm in the way of dessert? Yeah. Okay. All right. So.
Thank you.
So questions, and I don't mean questions like I said at the beginning, I don't have answers, just...
Well, let's hope you have an answer. How do school districts deal with, while you emphasize elementary children, with older children, middle school, high school kids who are coming with very limited English skills? We're also under the pressure of trying to get them to graduate.
Absolutely.
All of those outside influences, yet we want to acknowledge language development and how that works.
Yes, so with regard to your question, did you all hear his question about, most of my work has been done with elementary kids. So he's asking the question about secondary kids who come to this country at secondary school age. And so I'll flip off the very few things that we know. So those kids are sequential bilinguals. Clearly they come with one language and are age 12 or 13, and they're adding on a second language. They are sequential bilinguals. Okay, so they're in a different state. Now, we know about that group. We know the sequential bilinguals in middle school and high school who have been to school at least for 4 or 5 years do better than native-born second language learners who start kindergarten. They do better in school. They have the cognitive advantage. Now, the kids that we're really up against, are the kids who come to school and are 12 years old, speak no English, and have never been to school. Now, we also know that learning to read and write in their native language will give them a leg up in English also, but we think it's too late, and I'm putting too late in quotations because we tend to think that we've got to rush to get them, and we do. There's a lot of pressure for kids to pass high stakes tests. Some states have tests. You can't graduate from high school unless you can pass an exit exam in English, and we think that more English is better, and we don't have much research to support that, but that's a very common practice. So, what do we know? And we also know that there's what we call the saturation point theory. Have any of you tried to learn another language? Before I went to Italy a few years ago, and I thought, everybody in my family was like, Italian's kind of like Spanish. Let's just listen to tapes, get permits or something. So we tried, and we said, let's do it for 20 minutes. Let's do it for an hour a night. By 20 minutes, we'd all have it. That's what you call the psychological saturation point. No matter how motivated you are, how much you want to learn a second language, there's only so much you can intake at any one time. So a 6-hour school day is way, that's offered all in English, is way, way, way too much for a beginning speaker of a second language. They simply need some time to process, to think. And we also worried. I was involved in a study. I wasn't the lead person in the study in a high school in Denver, where the principal said to me, you know, we're worried about all those kids sit together at lunch and only speak in Spanish. What do you think they're doing? I don't know. That's what I'm worried about. So they're probably talking about boyfriends and lipstick. I don't think they're plotting to overthrow the U.S. government. Rest assured. But that's the way we act. And so they need times like study halls. They need times like lunch. They need social times when they can interact with each other in their native language. And that's not time taken away from English. That's time that we're investing in making sure that this child doesn't disengage because we're giving them too much English too fast. I don't know if that was a satisfactory answer to your question, but it's a big issue. It's a huge issue. Absolutely. Okay, another question? Whoa. Okay, go ahead.
When teachers have this attitude towards the semi-lingualism thing that they often say, like, they don't even know their own language. What's the way to help them see? Sometimes they are Spanish speakers, oftentimes they are, and I don't speak Spanish. So how can I help them see that there is value in that and they can build on it?
Yeah, I think you have to use real child examples and shoot like the ones that I gave you, and there are plenty that you can get in here. And it's not just teachers. Like I said, we have a research community out there, some of whom are perpetuating the very same kinds of issues. So what I'm arguing for with colleagues is a new look. What is a new normal, and how can we tell that this child is really normally developing and using both of their languages? It's not just your school and your teachers. One of the things I ask people sometimes is like, if you were going to go back and do this talk with your school, what would be the thing that people might be the most resistant to? You know, don't start with that one. Start with what? Save that one for later on. So I don't know if that, it is an attitude that we have to change. It's a national attitude that we have to change. We, when you get old like me, you wax nostalgic. And so when I was a child of the 50s and the Russians shot up Sputnik, and then the next year everybody was we had two things. It was a national, the NSF, the National Science Foundation was created, and so was another foundation called FLES, Foreign Language in the Elementary School. And the idea was everyone in U.S. schools was going to be bilingual by the end of the 1960s. That worked real well, of course. But that was the idea, that the Russians shot. So we haven't really ever gotten serious about what it means. We're lucky that by happenstance we're a nation of immigrants, so we have a lot of bilingual resources that we haven't had to develop. And we're also lucky that we have people who are interested in this country and doing things like working abroad, so they will learn language on their own. But we've never seriously invested in the potential for all of our citizenry to know one language, more than one language. And that's, I think, what it's going to take for us to understand. So consequently, we have a lot of misunderstandings about what it means to be bilingual.
Yet the Foreign Service has billions of dollars of teaching people to learn two languages, and the armed forces does the same thing.
Absolutely, yeah. So we can do it, and yet we operate with a lot of stereotypes. U.S. people go to the rest of the world, and nobody does a special school for them. Why are we doing a special bilingual school for these Mexican kids? The first thing the military does in any country is set up an American school. So the kids can learn in English. So yeah, we don't. Again, we're not vested yet as a nation that says we really want bilingual people. And I believe we've got millions of English-speaking parents who would love for their children to learn two languages. And you see the waiting lists of dual language schools around the country that are evidence for that. Yeah. Did you have another? Oh, you had.
It's sort of a personal question. We have a lot of students that are transitioning from Spanish to English, but they don't make a lot of transferring when they're like in sixth grade. So there's a lot of cognitive issues, maybe some learning disabilities that are not foreseen, but they can't seem to either learn in one or the other. So we're stuck in that section when they're in sixth grade, and they're not moving forward in either language.
They're not moving forward in English, and you're not teaching them in Spanish anymore?
They receive some instruction in Spanish, especially in literacy. They do receive interventions in Spanish, but are not, they're just not, they themselves have lost that lack of willingness. Because
Well, that's a different issue. So one thing is cognition. A whole other thing is engagement and motivation. And I would say to you that engagement and motivation may be a bigger issue that we're facing with two-language kids than ones of cognition, of not understanding. And also, I think what we're doing, no offense to anyone in this room, although I've heard that people say things like, we have used too many monolingual English strategies thinking that they'll work in service of two-language kids instead of developing bilingual strategies for learning. And so I'm going to use that. A lot of our reading programs for teaching Spanish, our English reading programs translated into Spanish. And then, again, when kids don't take it on, we don't stop to think, oh my goodness, maybe we should have started teaching the vowels instead of the consonants, and instead of teaching the consonants and the vowels. What sense does it make to teach onset and rhyme in Spanish when the power is at the end of the word and not the beginning of the word? I mean, so there are those kinds of things I think we haven't considered. Another thing is that transition really is an oxymoron. Transition sort of means gradually something, right? I have my arm in this thing because I haven't roller skated in 40 years, and my granddaughter wanted me to teach her to roller skate over spring break, so I took her. Now, I should have transitioned into roller skating little by little. I should have gone out and practiced, going around and around to see if I could still do it. Instead, I said, it's like riding a bike. I'll get out there and, we'll have a good time. So not quite like that. And I think a whole lot of bilingual programs in the United States are like that. There's no transition. It's you're in bilingual one day and you're not the next. So we need to keep on English language development. We need to keep on doing that, even after kids transition. We need to keep on doing Spanish literacy instruction, and we need explicit and direct strategies for helping kids connect what they know in one language to another one. Bob Jimenez, a really nice colleague who's at Vanderbilt University, has done some really nice studies with good bilingual readers. He interviewed them, and the good bilingual readers said things like, I look at a word and I think about, do I know a word like that in Spanish? I look at all the words around it. Kids who weren't so good, who were bilingual kids, didn't see that there was any connection between Spanish and English. We assume that some of that transfer and transition is going to happen, that the kid's going to make the connection instead of us helping them explicitly understand the connections between their two languages. And so I think there's a lot about transition that we need to think about much more carefully. We just sort of, we got it till second grade, then third grade you're on your own, or fourth grade for sure, you're out and you're on your own, and a lot of times our teachers don't have the skills to help the kids connect what they know in two languages. That's a huge area. Need and development for you young people who want to get PhDs. Yeah.
I just have to say thank you for all the work that you've done in the field. Not a day goes by, I don't think that I draw from what I've learned from your research, and it's informing the work that we're doing every day. So in my district, we're working on developing an assessment framework for our two-way immersion program, and we've been using the side-by-side writing samples. But now just listening to, we've just been having conversations with our teachers about doing like side-by-side running records and thinking about how oral language also influences for our emerging bilinguals. But now that I'm listening to, is a running record in Spanish even a valid assessment of Spanish reading?
Well, I mean, we use the EDL and DRA in our work, and that is a running record, and that's because right now we don't really have another good alternative. Here's what I'm going to say that we've had some success with, and that is we group kids in English by their Spanish reading outcomes and not their English reading outcomes, because if you group kids by their English reading outcomes, you're likely underestimating what they can do. What you do a lot in English is you're looking at the child's proficiency in oral English and not what they're doing in reading. So we're teaching reading strategies at the kids' English level that they likely already have, when we could be working on things like language development and comprehension and meta-linguistic skills. So we're doing, that's a hard sell, because you say, well, we should be teaching kids at level 18, but when we test them on the DRA, they're only at level 10. And I think we should be teaching them as if they're 18 in reading, because that's what their reading is. Now, our English strategies that we use to teach kids have to be different. Yeah, because we're teaching language in that case. We're not teaching strategies of reading. Yeah. So yeah, we're still monkeying around with it. How's that for a good research term? There's a lot of work that we still need to do. There's way more work that can, it's going to occupy the next 30 or 40 years. But we have to get interested in it. And I fear that we're so vested in a monolingual common core that we're forgetting what it's going to take for our two-language kids or their potential in